I wanted to take a brief moment to discuss the topic of gods slash ancient mythologies, and also briefly to discuss the subject of sex from a spiritual perspective. If that makes sense. So we'll delve a little bit more into that later. But first, on the subject of gods and mythology, right? I'm not. Please try to understand. I'm not speaking for every single person that inhabited the ancient world. There's going to be some variance here, but I'm particularly speaking about the wise, quote unquote. The poets and the prophets and the philosophers, and the way that they're sort of approaching and thinking about a lot of the gods and spirits and things like that, because I think not everyone, there are plenty of people who kind of get it. They're involved enough to sort of see the dynamic, the patterns between various thinkers. But I don't think a lot of people do, and so it's kind of worth delving into. So I think we're very used to, in our modern day society, conceptualizing myths as sort of just stories that primitive people told themselves in order to try to explain why the weather is the way it is, things like that, right? And I'm sure some cultures perhaps did, or perhaps not the cultures in general, but some people within the cultures did sort of conceptualize in very simplistic terms. But because we're so used to competing mythologies and thinking of them more or less as fictional, works of fictional literature that only the particular culture thought of as somehow being literally real in the way that they've described it, gives us a false image. And also, I think our familiarity with the concept of the dogma of the Catholic Church, for instance, the idea that you kind of have to believe a certain doctrine in order to be part of this culture, this climate, this religious organization, group, whatever you want to call it. So because our civilization has kind of grown up with these ideas, I think a lot of people have very easy misinterpretations and misunderstandings of the ancient view of gods and spiritual beings, etc. When you read a lot more of it, for instance, when you're reading the Iliad or the Aeneid, and you see that sort of like the scales drop from the eyes of this or that character, and they're able to see the invisible world. They're able to see the gods taking to the field of battle, and what they thought before was a bunch of people fighting. They can now sort of see there's this divine influence and everything that's going on. But I think perhaps one of the clearest examples of the ancient mindset of the so-called wise can be seen in, for instance, the Symposium, Plato's Symposium, which is the story of essentially Socrates going to a dinner party where the guests at the dinner party sort of challenge each other to a game of sorts, where they're each supposed to describe the goddess of love, and whoever makes the most compelling argument for the nature of the goddess of love sort of wins their little game. They're the evening's winner at the party. And of course, Socrates, at the end of the day, is the one who everyone agrees has ultimately won. But you can see where they all sort of delve into metaphorical language, and nobody calls them out on it. Nobody ever says, well, that's not real. You just made that up. How could you possibly know if the goddess of love is doing any of that stuff? It's clear to all of them, okay, these are sort of metaphors, but this on some level accurately reflects the way that we experience love in the world, right? It sort of reflects what love is in some way that we can all understand and relate to it, even though it may not necessarily be literal in a direct sense, right? I think we also see an example of this, well, several examples of it really, but at least one really good example in the book of Genesis, for instance, right? We have this moment where God sort of separates the waters from the waters, separates the upper waters from the lower waters. And, earlier we had read about how God was hovering over the deep, with the deep waters being, part of Tehom, right? Tehom is analogous to Tiamat from surrounding mythology, and a lot of people are tempted to make the mistake of thinking of that as, oh, the ancient Jewish people were stealing the mythology of surrounding cultures. Because again, we're used to thinking of these mythologies as like all fictional stories with no real crossover. The way we would think, like, you can't say that Harry Potter, has any particular views on the way that Buzz Lightyear, guards the galaxy or whatever, because those two fictional characters operate in different realities that don't intersect in any way, right? So these competing mythologies, these competing worldviews, they don't touch, they don't mix in the minds of a lot of people. You can't really, find any intersection between them other than, this is the way this ancient culture thought of things, and this is the way this ancient culture thought of things. But when you see the ancients actually interacting, there's definitely sort of ease with which they, adopt each other's mythological language, but, adapt it. And then they can sort of like have arguments about it, or they can have different thoughts about the way that the gods are, because they're all sort of speaking the same roughly non-literal language. I mean, there is some literal aspect to it, just not in the direct sense that we're used to thinking about. Like, it's flowery language, but it's still meant to describe a sort of spiritual reality, which is exactly how it can intersect, right? So, for instance, when the Jewish people are saying that, God separated the waters, and sort of it's got this parallel to Mesopotamian mythologies where, Tiamat and her husband, represented two different kinds of water, salt water and fresh water, and the way that they were, together at one point and then separated when the children killed the husband, and da 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 da. And it seems like the Jewish people are just taking somebody else's mythology and, twisting it for their own purposes. When, in reality, what these people are doing, common enough practice at the time, is they are essentially making a philosophical argument, right? They all share this understanding of a metaphysical, spiritual reality which can be described in metaphorical terms. However, different thinkers are going to have slightly different interpretations about how these things probably intersect, right? And because of their different analyses, different interpretations, come to different conclusions, they're able to put forward these arguments about how the gods probably are. And they sort of win the argument, if you will, by making, by saying something that makes sense to the widest audience possible. This is the most compelling because it just clicks with the reader. They look at it and go, yeah, that totally puts, all the pieces together for me. This is the way that love interacts with nature and war and things like that. So that is kind of what it boils down to at the end of the day, is they're each trying to describe the metaphysical reality while also making their own arguments about what other cultures may have gotten right or may have gotten wrong. And then the Jewish argument tends to be more on the side that all of their neighbors have basically a bad philosophical take with everything, right? So, for instance, a lot of the surrounding mythologies had sort of the first god parents coming out of chaos. So they had an origin. They had a point at which they were born, before which point there was only, some sort of, chaos or cosmic egg or something to that effect, right? Or original waters or something, whatever the original substance is. By interacting with this original substance, you can sort of, bypass the gods and obtain a magical power that is beyond them. You can rise above them because you have mastered this art, this talent that that the other spirits are compelled to obey in some sense. The rules that everyone is compelled to follow, which no entity is beyond, right? But the Jewish people take this view that this primordial substance out of which every abstract entity descends originally is actually alive. It's personal. It has a certain way that it wants the world to be, and there is nothing that supersedes its own authority. There is no rules which it has to obey. The ultimate reality supersedes all governing laws and principles, and there is no amount of magical development that would allow you to get past that level of authority over reality. So you have to cooperate with it and find your identity in it and oneness with it, because trying to get around it or go around it is just not going to work. It's just not possible in the Jewish view, and that's part of the argument that they're making. And they make several other, counter arguments as well. A lot of them can be found in Genesis, but a lot of the laws that they make in the subsequent books of the law are also ultimately arguments against other cultures, other surrounding societies. The fact that Moses is able to beat these Egyptian magicians. At no point does the story of Exodus argue like, oh, the power of these magicians isn't real, their magic doesn't really exist, they're just delusional. No, it poses this idea that they have some real supernatural power granted to them by, I guess you could say, something like real entities in a sense. However, they just don't hold a candle to, the real power behind the universe, the real power behind everything that is. And so if that real ultimate reality isn't on your side, then everything you do is going to come up short, especially when compared to someone who does have that ultimate reality on their side, whose power comes from that ultimate reality. And there's a point where even Moses himself, at one point he tries to sort of take credit, not super intentional, but in a fit of frustration, he goes to take credit for the powers which are ultimately just being channeled through him, but aren't really his own doing at the end of the day. So it's a kind of this example of trying to attribute to the lower egoic identity, the ego self, the power and authority of the true ultimate reality. And again, that seems more like an act of frustration on his part in the moment. But we can also see that, in that moment of frustration, he is at the same time revealing some true element of what he actually, thinks on some level or believes. And it's because of that incorrect mindset that he's not really able to enter the promised land. The promised land is this sort of like, it's not just a physical place, but it's also a spiritual state, which one can only really enter if they're in the proper mindset. And the proper mindset is not one of, complaint, and it's not one of, consideration for all of the things that we must do, the burdens that we must face. It's the, acceptance of a whole different way of living and cooperating with the power that is behind the universe, the power that is behind the world that we know, the ultimate authority of reality. And then, as we sort of move into the topic of sexuality, I guess we can still kind of talk about Genesis in this respect, right? Because there's a particular moment that sort of gets a little bit of a brief condemnation, if you will, wherein we see that these spiritual entities, the sons of God, took a particular interest and then laid with the daughters of man, right? And there's also a reference to, the great men of renown, these, Nephilim, and not really much of an explanation given as to what that even is. The audience is just expected to understand. But if we consider the surrounding culture, it's really not surprising that they would bring up this concept of these sort of like demigod beings, because the surrounding culture had all of these, god kings and demigod heroes that were, children of divine beings, and that was their claim to fame, and then the subsequent claim to fame of their descendants, is that they are, in some respect, the children of the gods. That, as a consequence, these special elites inherited a particular authority that other people don't really possess, because they're not descended from the same stock. They haven't inherited the same, mystical rights, and by extension, the same mystical, authority. And, those surrounding cultures had their reasons for thinking in those terms, thinking in that way. They're sort of projecting outward this supernatural reality, onto their environment, right? The idea of Julius Evola, who I know some people mistakenly think is like some sort of racist or something like that, even though he multiple times condemns racism. He talks a little bit about, how to put it, the sort of the idea of the king of the center that a lot of cultures had, whether it be, the yellow king of China with the color yellow representing the earth, or, whether they talk about, and again, we have all of these, mystical god kings and pharaohs who are representative of these, higher beings and their authority. So we have a physical reality that parallels a spiritual reality and sort of represents it to us. But then, the Jewish argument sort of strikes that down and says, no, these guys are really just, warlike barbarians. We're not necessarily even denying that they have some sort of spiritual descendants. We're willing to grant that, somehow the divine beings, the sons of God, had some sort of relations with the daughters of man. But whatever it was inappropriate. It wasn't something to be celebrated, and it's not a good reason to give these people any special weight or authority. It's actually the product of some, bad mixture that never should have been, an inappropriate sexual relationship that never should have taken place. And part of the thinking behind that, you have to realize, is that really the ultimate authority is from within. and I talked about this in the previous video, sort of the connection that we have to the divine as it manifests within the animating spirit that is the life within us, right? Holy Spirit, the divine spirit is Ruach HaKodesh. So it can be translated as like Holy Spirit or Holy Breath or Holy Presence. Can also be translated as divine inspiration, right? Which is the source of prophecy. So whenever the Spirit comes upon a prophet, and then they'll usually while they're like singing or playing some sort of instrument with other people, suddenly the Spirit will come down, descend upon them, and they'll be able to prophesy, right? This divine ecstatic, inspiration taking place, and that state is, enables them to discern the future to some extent. There's some talk in Samuel, or on the topic of Samuel, about the ancient prophets being called seers at one point, being paid in silver to essentially render these foretellings and give this sort of spiritual advice in almost a shamanic capacity, right? They're being paid to be spiritual advisors at one point early in time during the days just after Moses, for example, right? So we have in that story this representation of the Jewish people who are who just lost a previous battle, and who, even though the battle ultimately was won by spiritual means, their enemy was overthrown by supernatural powers that had nothing to do with military might at all. The Jewish people still wanted to have an earthly king, not just to rule over them as we might conceptualize the point of having a king in our modern day standards, but really they wanted a sort of supreme military authority in order to organize their fighting forces so that they wouldn't have to fear their martial and military enemies, right? Which is, in their view, sort of the point of having a king, is to organize the military so that you don't lose battles and wars, so that other surrounding cultures can't take things from you. But really, they're supposed to be in this state of faith, of trust, where you just trust essentially the universe, God, the ultimate authority to look after you, so you don't really have to worry about taking care of yourself. You can just try to live a better inner life, and that should be your focus, right? And instead they're concerned with, we need to be prepared to be able to win these battles. And so they demand that their prophet give them some sort of a king, right? That he makes some sort of a declaration that, yes, this person will be our ruler. And they actually, make a point to mention that God himself is against the idea of the people having a king, right? So again, you can see this is really, in essence, a philosophical argument against the attitude of the surrounding cultures. Now, ultimately, they do end up with a king, and, to an extent, the kings are kind of celebrated, particularly David, but you get to see that even David, like the prime example of a good king, is still corrupt in many ways. He still does things which are essentially inappropriate. And, but he's a good man on the whole. It's just he has his shortcomings the same as anyone. And then, not long after him, things already start going downhill. One thing a lot of people don't realize, a lot of people think of the number 666 as being like a gematria reference, that you're supposed to decode the number into letters to form someone's name, and that tells you, who you should think of as the beast, right? But if you read the Book of Kings and pay attention to the story of Solomon, he first goes wrong when he starts extracting 666 pieces of gold from his mines, which there's this whole part about God saying that the king shouldn't extract extra gold for himself, shouldn't, get a bunch of extra horses for himself, and shouldn't take extra wives for himself. So, here's this man who did right in the first place by, asking for the wisdom to rule his people. And, he could have been great. In fact, David anticipated Solomon to be, the one that was prophesied to, build this temple, not really considering the possibility that the temple was like an inner temple, the temple of the body of man, right? But we see that Solomon, though he had potential, ultimately went wrong when he first started acquiring more money for himself. And then, after the 666 annual pieces of gold that he was getting, he started accruing horses for himself, and then wives, and all of the things he was told not to accrue for himself. And then we're told that the wives essentially bring all of their idols with him, and it eventually causes Solomon to, engage in idol worship and then spread that, and it causes ultimately the corruption of the entire society of Israel, to the point that not long afterward, the kings, like King Ahab, is driving out Elijah, the prophet of God, from the land. They've totally embraced idol worship. In fact, they're killing the prophets of God when they find them. And then eventually Israel itself collapses, just as Moses had predicted that it would, because people are incapable of following the law, as I mentioned in the previous episode. So, the problems all begin with this sort of dependence on earthly and material security. For Solomon, it seems like the beginning point is the 666 pieces of gold, which is why, we're eventually told in, the book of Revelations, yes, mark well the mark of the beast, or calculate the number of the beast. The number is 666. And without the mark of the beast, you won't be able to buy or sell goods, right? You become a pariah from society because you don't have this dependence on material wealth and material security. You haven't, in Jesus' words, pledged your loyalty to mammon, or to money, as it were, because his concept, you can only be loyal to either God or money and not both, right? And so again, it seems like Solomon's problems begin with accruing money, but really you can look before that to where the people of Israel decided that they actually needed to have a king, to have this, material security for their well-being, because they couldn't simply trust that things would take care of themselves. They couldn't trust a higher reality to be for them, to be in their favor. And then when, Jesus comes along, that's sort of what he's constantly trying to, convince people to do. When he heals people, he doesn't say, "You're welcome, I healed you." He usually says, "Your faith has healed you." He goes around complaining that, his disciples couldn't cast out a demon because they didn't have sufficient faith. Or, if only they had faith the size of a mustard seed, they could move a mountain. If only they had a little bit of faith, they could, tell trees to uproot themselves and move to different locations. All of these things that come from faith. And how does he understand faith? He says, if that even Solomon isn't arrayed as splendidly as, these little colorful flowers of the field, and if God has so arrayed the grass of the field, will he not more take care of man? In other words, here you are so reliant on your own activity, on trying to, secure things for yourself, secure the material conditions of life, and you have no trust, no security at all in this, spiritual reality to take care of you, right? Alright, so this kind of falls along with a very similar mindset in Taoism, where it's exactly this effort to sort of handle things yourself. You feel this need to act in your own benefit. And if you don't, somehow things will fall apart. But when you let go of that need to try to act in your own benefit, and you just instead you flow with the universe, sort of you flow with the Tao, then things will suddenly just go smooth for you. You'll be like, a drunk who, without even meaning to do so, just rolls off a wagon and doesn't even get injured because their body is loose. So they don't, because they're not bracing themselves when they fall, they are able to just sort of roll with the impact, and so they're not injured at the end. As the result, right? It's exactly the endeavor to do things for yourself, to secure things for yourself because you can't trust the reality to take care of you, that causes ultimately many of the problems that we have with life and our own sort of neurotic tendencies and ultimately our dissatisfaction with the world around us, and many of the evils that mankind perpetrate as a result of their dissatisfaction and the fear that comes from feeling like without this activity to secure our own well-being, that everything will just somehow fall apart, right? I suppose I've sort of veered off the topic of sex, but just coming back to that now that we've had a chance to sort of discuss the spiritual reality and the idea that's supposed to push us toward storing our treasures in heaven, as it were, right? We can begin to examine the difference between vulgar sex, if you will, and then the sort of higher sexual mystery, I guess you could call it, right? And here I have in mind a particular, I don't want to say Hindu, but not really. It's like a Vedic practice, I suppose, wherein you can, have sex for this practice. But you don't necessarily have to, right? It's sufficient, really, to just visualize. Not you're just like imagining sex, but really, you're imagining. In some terms, it's I believe Kali and why am I drawing a blank on this one? I forget his name for some reason, but her husband, essentially the Hindu god of destruction in the Trimurti, Shiva, yes, Shaivism, Shiva. That's right. That you imagine them together, and you sort of interpret Shiva as more or less as consciousness, right? Whereas Kali represents sort of like matter and the energy of the universe, if you will, coming together just as the consciousness comes together with our bodies to create the whole reality that is us, right? So that is, in essence, the higher reality of sex, that the lower corresponding reality sort of apes or mimics, but it only can mimic it, really. It can never be fully satisfying in and of itself, and I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with me on that point, at least just jokingly, but they're talking about like deeper life satisfaction here, without this completeness or wholeness within the self, this sort of unification, or in Jungian terms, we might call it this individuation of the self, this process of bringing all the parts of you together and becoming whole. That without that, we can never find true satisfaction in life, true lasting joy or peace or anything like that. So, and even in a sort of Christian mindset, right? They talk about the earthly marriage being sort of a sign of the mystery behind it. I believe Paul is the one who talks a little bit about the mystery of marriage, right? Or the mystery behind it, if you will. And that reflects, they talk a little bit about Christ as the bridegroom who in the end will marry the church in the day that the old heaven and earth pass away and the new heaven and earth come in, which are going to be combined, so that we don't even need the sun to be able to see. We can see by sort of the light of God. In the last episode, I talked a little bit about the sort of the invisible light of the philosophical Platonic concept of the good, right? So, be able to see essentially by, I suppose in today's terms, you might call it just by like psychic intuition. You could walk anywhere with your eyes closed because you just know everything around you without any physical light necessary to see anything. You could, in the terms of some Christian mystics, you could navigate by the quote unquote the light of faith, right? Trusting that you don't have to try to look with your eyes because you can just know what's really happening. You have access to the spiritual reality and spiritual truth, and you trust that more than you trust your own eyes. And because of that, you can find truth where other people don't really see. They're blinded by what they see right in front of their face. There's this passage where Jesus talks about the eyes being the lamp of the body. Part of the reason he's saying that is because the audience he's talking to have again been influenced by 500 years of Greek philosophical thought spreading throughout the Mediterranean, including Democritus and later Plato and Plotinus, spreading these ideas that the eyes cast out some sort of rays onto the surrounding environment, which interacts with the light from the sun and comes back to us, and that's what allows us to see. So, literally, the eye is the lamp of the body. It contains the fire of Venus, it's called, casting out these rays that enable sight. Right? So he says the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye be single, in other words, if you've got good vision, then your body is filled with light because you can see. And if your eye is evil, if you have bad vision, then it's filled with darkness. You're blind. You can't see. It is filled with darkness. All you see is darkness. Because you don't have vision, right? But he then goes on to say, if the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Right? In other words, if you can see, but you're still blind, then you are utterly blind. And he's saying that sort of in reference to, in regard to the Pharisees, right? As these men who can see, they can technically see what's in front of them, but they can't discern the reality behind it. Because they don't have discernment, because they can't walk by the light of faith, because they don't really have a true grasp of the underlying sort of metaphysical, spiritual reality. They can't see the truth. They can't intuit. They can't follow the spirit of the law. They're bound by the letter of the law because that's all they know is what's right in front of their face. Then even though they can physically see, they are actually totally blind. And blind in a way that's worse than physical blindness. Because physical blindness doesn't prevent you from being able to see the truth, from being able to see by the invisible light cast by the invisible sun, which is the good, right? But being unable to sort of see by the light of faith, to be able to see by the invisible light cast by the good, they are blind in a way that makes their physical sight irrelevant. That makes it in a sense, worthless because they're missing all of the important things of life, the important things around them, the things that they ought to be focused on. And that's the greater blindness, in fact. It's unfortunate if you're physically blind, but it's hopelessly tragic if you're blind to this, invisible true light, if you will, right? And so sex is very tied into that, right? Because, there's this list of all of these, so-called impure, immoral sexual acts, but what's really ultimately at the end of the day, what's immoral about these things is not so much the specific nature of the act themselves. It's the fact that the true point of it, that the spiritual reality that's supposed to be behind the sexual act, that you're, only doing this as an expression of this coming closer to a state of total union and mystical oneness, has been utterly abandoned in favor of the pleasures of the body, right? So the higher, more important spiritual reality has been cast aside in favor of this, gross, not gross in the sense of, ew, gross, but gross in the sense of like physical, material, dense and devoid of inherent meaning, lower reality, right? There's this other passage that I'm thinking of as well, and suddenly I'm drawing a blank on that, having trouble calling it to mind. It essentially talks about, what is it? I can't remember. I'll have to come back to that later. But yeah, so there are certain techniques, even in the Jewish tradition. This is talked about a little bit by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan in his book entitled Jewish Meditation, which, if you haven't read his works, I very much recommend and might do audiobooks for. Aryeh Kaplan's Jewish Meditation, Meditation in the Bible, Meditation in Kabbalah. My only reservation right now with the audiobooks, it's not a huge one, but there are a couple factors to consider. Obviously, the big one is I don't know how long I'll be able to get away with doing these audiobook readings before the law comes down on me and basically says, hey, you don't have, a license to read these works publicly online. You need to pay this author such and such if you want to be able to keep this video up, or I don't really know how the process works. I'd have to look into it. I suppose for now, I'm just going to keep doing it and, crediting the authors that I'm reading from. And then hopefully, if these videos ever do catch enough attention for someone to look in my direction, then I'll be able to resolve it relatively easily. But I suppose we'll just have to see how that goes. At any rate, but yeah, so the point at the end of the day is just to understand the ancient view of the metaphysical reality, right? That the metaphysical reality sort of supersedes the physical reality in importance. The physical reality can often be blinding to important truths that can only be understood if one is sort of in touch with the higher spiritual metaphysical reality. And that a lot of these cultures aren't really talking past each other. There's a lot of agreement that is happening between them on, the is the existence of these beings that, some consider gods and some just consider the sons of God, etc. And the way that these spiritual powers influence the world, things like that. But there's also room for a kind of philosophical disagreement because, a lot of these people don't really fully understand it, and they even would say that themselves probably, that the prophets can look upon the metaphysical reality, delve into it a little bit, and be able to bring back some reports about what it's like on the other side, if you will. But there are things about it which are ultimately beyond our grasp, if you will, beyond our current comprehension. So, we have the pieces, we don't necessarily know how all the pieces fit together, and so because of that, there is some room for interpretation, because there's a lot we don't know. So we can actually sit here and argue about what certain things mean, what they imply about the other reality or the other side of reality, what we can know about it and what we can't know, and how we should respond as a result of what we can be more sure of, to the extent that anyone can be sure of anything. And I think there's probably a little bit more agreement in ancient times, simply because a lot of them, I think, did feel that they were more or less operating on the same basic wavelength, but differing in interpretation and in some of their conclusions, right? Whereas nowadays, I think we've reached a level of separation, like, children who don't want their peas mixed with their mashed potatoes, to the point that we really can't see how these things intersect, and so we just keep them all totally separate from each other. And because we keep them separate from each other, I think there's this tendency to actually take them more literally than was originally intended, in a way. There are some people that take them less literally than they need to, and think that it's all just about, the weather and what makes the crops grow and things like that, instead of being like a spiritual, metaphysical reality. And on the other hand, there are people that take it so literally that, they'll sit there and say, well, this isn't what, Ra or Osiris would have wanted, or, whatever. This is the spirit, feels like you're a loser. I don't know, whatever they believe about what this or that spirit thinks. And it's like, I think you're treating it a little bit too much like a person who is dynamic and capable of change, and not as like an eternal reality, as like a metaphorical, pseudo-metaphorical understanding of an abstract metaphysical reality, right? So it's become like too personal. You've taken something spiritual and rendered it completely gross, and also slightly disgusting in a way. Not, rendering judgment, just kind of entering the weird zone a little bit. Whereas, the ancient mindset, typically speaking, I can't speak for everyone that existed in ancient times, but typically speaking, would have understood it in a more, like, we only have these physical expressions to relate it to, even though we know these expressions are ultimately inadequate. We know this doesn't really do it justice at the end of the day, but this is all that we have in order to be able to talk about these subjects. This is the only language that we can render it into in order to make it something that we can actually talk about. Because otherwise it's just totally trapped in this realm of only personal experience, even though we can compare our experiences and see what lines up. See that, impressively enough, things line up at all in the first place, and then sort of match them and compare and contrast and try to come to a more clear understanding of what it is we're experiencing when we enter these, altered states, when we have these, experiences. But, most of, at least again, the wise wouldn't have literally thought about the gods as actually having particular emotions and actually having particular literal reality attitudes toward certain topics or certain people or things like that. Those are just metaphors in order to be able to understand and relate how this force or this metaphysical concept interacts with this situation, right? So if this kingdom keeps getting into all of these battles and conflicts, it's because they must be loved by the god of war. He's like trying to be their patron or something like that. It's an apt metaphor. It's an apt sort of poetic description of the metaphysical forces surrounding this environment, the situation. But it's not literally a guy trying to, relate to these people in that sort of mundane sense. It's not like, Chuck comes up to you and is trying to be your buddy or something like that. It's something more than that, higher than that, deeper than that. But we have to put it in words that we can exchange and convey. Otherwise, what can be said about just, I experience this sort of thing, like a vibration, like a, force, or like a, gaseous sort of, energy that reminds me of, who knows, You're just searching for something adequate in order to say, in order for other people to understand what it is you've just experienced. That there's at the end of the day, there's nothing that's truly appropriate, and in fact, that ends up being a complaint that a lot of alchemists, European alchemists, end up having. Well, not only European alchemists, it's also complained about in Cultivating the Tao, where he talks about, we're talking about setting up the tripod in order to make the elixir, but only idiots think that the tripod is like a literal tripod. Like, do better. That's sort of the attitude that he takes, and that's the attitude that a lot of alchemists take toward what they call the puffers, right? So the people that were out there literally trying to turn these base metals into literal actual gold were, in the view of more of the like hermetic alchemists, were way off base and a bit out of touch, right? The point for them was this sort of spiritual transformation of the self into a perfect being that could subsist after death, kind of like, the saints and those demigods who supposedly became gods. They're trying to analyze and understand how to reach this state of apotheosis, and other people are trying to literally make gold so they can get rich. And so it kind of like annoys the sort of the true hermetic alchemists that these other people are being called alchemists, but they're sitting there trying these like ridiculous get-rich-quick experiments. Not that hermetic alchemists never ever tried different chemical experiments, but more that they tended to use the language of proto-chemistry in order to talk about something which, again, is difficult to talk about when you don't really have an appropriate language for it, because it's not really something that you can properly experience through the senses. You can only relate it to things you have experienced with the senses. But in truth, it's something that you can only just know, that you can just feel, that you can understand, sort of, in usually a sort of vague sense, but not something that you can usually concretely say, yes, it's exactly this, right? So at this point, I probably over-explained it. I'm sure several of you got it like 30 minutes ago, and I apologize, but I like waxing poetic about this sort of thing. So I think I'll go ahead and bring this video to an end, though. This has been the Necromancer, signing off.